purchased the CZ P09 a few months back, and as of October 15th, I have just over 2,000 rounds to the pistol, and these are my findings thus far. The ergonomics of the gun are very comfortable, not just in my hands but to many others. Just about every person who is alright with flat-sided grips finds the pistol to fit their hands very well. The length of pull of the trigger is excellent, and I find that I have plenty of room to add or take away trigger finger. The adjustable back straps do not necessarily adjust the length of pull, as each differently sized back strap is essentially tapered to the same size at the top, where the joint of the index finger begins to travel towards the trigger, making the length of pull virtually the same across all the different back straps. However, the back straps are always useful in helping fit the gun to multiple users or preferences, especially with filling in your palm. The sides of the grip, as I mentioned before, are completely flat, and to some people this makes the gun less comfortable, as they feel that there's too much spacing between their mid-palm and the sides of the grip. But I find that flat-sided grips allow for more trigger control, as I have a little bit more leeway to figuring out how I want to slap the trigger, and yes, I said slap, figuring out how much trigger finger I need for this trigger in order to adjust for the actual weight to get the real break that I want. So I have more control over how I want to run the gun when I have a flat-sided grip. The pistol has a fairly generous mag well. It has beveled edges along the sides which help with feeding the magazine into the magazine well. The problem is, though, the magazines have so many ledges and edges to them that you often find yourself getting caught on the edges of the magazine well. Metgar is the company that CZ decided to contract with in order to make these magazines. With CZs, you are generally given very little real estate to work with in terms of grabbing onto the slide in order to rack it. The P09, in my experience, has been the easiest slide to get your hand onto. However, it is still a little harder than other brands, like Smith & Wesson obviously being one of them, or Glock. When it comes to dropping the slide while reloading, you are more than likely going to find that the support side thumb is going to be the way to go. If you're a right-handed shooter, your primary hand, you're just going to have a hell of a time trying to reach the slide stop. And in my experience, racking the slides with CZs, there's some people that can do it. Some people develop the technique with the slingshot method, where they turn the gun horizontally onto its side and they pinch the slide with their index finger and their thumb on the support side hand. I feel that that's still a little bit too slow for my taste. Other people have tremendous success with it, but I feel that just using the support side thumb to drop the slide lever like you would on an AR-15 is very conducive to a very quick reload. And it also helps with getting your support side hand into position a little bit faster, because when you have to reach up to the slide stop, your hand essentially just has to roll a little bit more forward and push a little bit more forward, and boom, you're in position. The trigger on the CZ P09 is not the best. I have a SIG Sauer 2340, not a very good gun, but the trigger is substantially better, at least in the double action pull, than the CZ P09. In my opinion, I don't think there's really anything you can do to the CZ to make it that much better. When you first get it, it's going to be heavy, it's going to be gritty, it's going to have a lot of these phantom stops in it. And what I mean by that is, whenever you pull a trigger, you feel that initial weight of the trigger, and you start to squeeze through it. As you squeeze through that initial weight or that initial wall, normally you feel a substantial amount of give, and then you hit the final wall just before the sear is about to drop. With the CZ, there's a lot of these phantom walls in between the final break. So there's not a whole lot you can do to smooth those out. I've polished up my internals a little bit and haven't had a whole lot of success. I've used third-party components, lighter springs from Cajun Gunworks, which do help with getting the trigger to be a little bit smoother. Once you get to 2,000 rounds, the trigger is going to be about as good as it's going to get for quite a while. So I probably won't see an improvement in the trigger's smoothness until another 5,000 rounds. Between the polishing and the Cajun Gunworks components, I can get the gun to about 9.75 pounds on the double action pull, and to about 3 pounds and 3/4 of a pound. So 3.75 pounds for the single action. The single action is really nice. There's very little creep in that, and well, at least noticeable. If you're sitting there and you're really trying to feel it out, you will feel the creep. But when you're actually using it, The double action is always a little bit problematic, but the single action is extremely easy to work with. Not as good as a 1911. There's still a considerable amount of travel, at least trigger travel and distance, and that single action pull. However, it's very, very manageable. The biggest issue I had with the CZ so far is the durability. Not too stellar. The recoil spring assembly, it's a captured guide rod, but it's not a single piece. So the guide rod itself is two pieces, and it continues to try to unscrew on me all the time, even when I applied Loctite to it. If the end of the guide rod did come undone, it wouldn't be the end of the gun. You would just be missing that component forever, and you would have an uncaptured spring inside of the gun. However, many different types of firearms utilize an uncaptured spring, and they're perfectly all right. As a matter of fact, once again, Cajun Gun Works, they offer an uncaptured guide rod and springs, and I've had a lot of success with them, but in my opinion, I tend to like a heavier spring. I don't do reloads, so I don't need to make power factor or anything like that. Also, the trigger return spring, which essentially allows the trigger to seat fully forward after every shot, or at least one of the components to help the trigger seat forward every single shot, completely broke on me. After 1,000 rounds with the pistol, I noticed that my trigger was feeling a little bit weird, and I hadn't replaced any of the other components yet. And I wasn't sure what was wrong with the trigger, and so I kept utilizing it. I was getting closer and closer to 1,000, and then I hit just over 1,000, and my trigger was not seating all the way forward when I was doing dry practice. So I pull the spring out, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, oh, it feels a little bit flimsy, and as soon as I touched it, it broke. And so this was just after 1,000 rounds. I thought that this must have been a 1 in a million's chance. You know, this is just bad luck. But I start researching around and finding that this is common for these guns to have this problem, which I found to be unacceptable. That alone makes me feel that this is not an acceptable pistol for duty use. It wasn't just 1,000 rounds, it was 1,000 rounds times maybe 5,000 trigger pulls between dry practice, maybe higher. However, I have so many rounds on the Glock, and I have so many dry practice presses, pulls, and the only things I've had to replace on that thing was the connector because I wanted to, and the recoil spring assembly because I wanted to. That never even broke on me. I understand that this is a high-use component of the gun, and it's going to require more maintenance than some other systems out there. However, I felt like this was something that needs to be addressed a little bit more closely. I replaced it with the Cajun Gun Works trigger return spring. So far, at that point, I put another 1,000 rounds on top of it, and a whole lot more dry practice than before, and it's been doing just fine. As far as working with the pistol and getting it up to speed, the gun can go fast. The double action pull does slow you down on that initial shot, but from the video clips previously, you'll see that if you can make out the time, I know there's a little bit fuzzy, but you'll see that my initial time on that one shot reload one shot was a .81. So I drew from the holster and got a shot off in less than a second. A sub-second time is pretty respectable. I've done a little bit faster before with the Glock 17. The CZ is very capable. The accuracy of this pistol, when I sandbagged it next to the Glocks, the grouping that the Glock was producing which is about 3-4 inches wide at 25 yards. Really respectable. I didn't think that the Glock was capable of doing that, and I had never sandbagged it before. The CZ, I'm using the stock sights. All I did was take the front sight off and spray paint it a high visibility orange, and I blacked out the white dots on the rear sight, so that way the front sight stands out a little bit more. The CZ grouped just as well as the Glocks. It didn't do any better as far as groupings were concerned. However, I find that when I'm actually shooting it, not on a bench, not in a ransom rest, not on a vise, when I'm just actively shooting it, it's a lot easier for me to plug into the gun to tell it what I want to have happen and to make it happen. With the Glocks, I always felt like I'm guessing a little bit. I have a feeling that's because of the choice in sights that I'm utilizing versus the sights that came with the CZ. So the Glock, I can run tremendously faster, hit different transitions and hit different targets very, very, very quickly. I'm not as fast with the CZ yet. I'm still working on it. I'm hoping around the 5,000 round mark I'll start to unlock or crack the code, if you will, break that plateau, and start seeing some better results. However, the gun's accuracy, for whatever reason, maybe it's the ergonomics, I find that I have a much easier time calling my shot, placing my shots with the CZ versus my Glocks. So with that said, the P09, I'm still going to keep shooting it despite the little flaws and problems that we've been having with it. The ergonomics are just, they're so good. And the gun is substantially, it doesn't seem that way at first, but it's substantially larger than the Glock 17. But every time I pick up the Glock 17, it feels like a compact firearm to me all of a sudden. So I'm enjoying the additional weight of this firearm compared to the Glock. It's not a whole lot of differences, it's a couple of ounces. I'm enjoying the additional weight, the additional size, the additional barrel length. I'm just enjoying this firearm despite its little flaws. And I'm looking super forward to taking it out to the range some more, and looking very, very forward to do some USPSA production class. So with that said, this is Jerry Grimm out. Thanks for listening. Have a good one.
Begins. Begin war.